Tigo. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're all familiar with the adage that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And sadly, the drafting of this bill and those people who are supporting this bill today are demonstrating their inability to learn from indeed quite recent history, 10, 15 years of history. The lessons have not been learned. And the key lesson that is evidently not been learned is that one-off, narrowly focused pieces of legislation are not the solution to complex, multifaceted social problems or the manifestations of those problems. It's not a difficult proposition. It's one that has been demonstrated repeatedly, even as recently as since the early and mid-1990s, that one-off legislative fixes will not be sufficient to deal with complex social problems. Mr. Mitchell has admitted this is not a silver bullet. Sadly, it is not any sort of a bullet. At best, it's a blunt instrument, and they might get some superficial satisfaction, perhaps even a degree of short-term political advantage from seeing one or two gang members arrested for either deliberately or accidentally contravening this law. Because given the farcical nature of some of the provisions of this law, it would actually be quite easy to accidentally contravene this law. And I support Mr. Goff's comments about the lack of consistency, the lack of clarity. But to return to the key point that we need to look at long-term solutions. We need to deal with root causes of crime and offending, and we need to look at the drivers of why do we have gangs? Why are the gangs manifesting in our communities? And why are they so embedded in some communities? And I see it close up and personal in Northland, Kaikoui, Moiriwa, Kaitaia. They are small towns in Northland where the gangs are prevalent, where they are influential in a negative way very often, though not always. And we do need to address the issues and the problems associated with their behaviours. This bill doesn't even begin to go anywhere near addressing the core symptoms, the causes of the offending and of the existence of these organisations. So a whole raft of legislation went through this House in the early mid-1990s, driven by a moral panic that largely came out of this debate about who's tough on crime, who's soft on crime. I have to say, sitting here watching that interchange of points of order recently about tough on crime, soft on crime, who's a petal, really we need to get beyond that. Tough on crime, soft on crime. How about let's be smart on crime? Let's think about smart solutions, 21st century real solutions to crime, to the problems of gangs in our communities and to the social behaviours that come alongside of that. The lesson of the 90s, which clearly has not been learned by some members of this House, is that the legislative solutions seldom generate any measurable positive outcomes. We had law passed about association, criminal association. We had law that enabled local authorities and police to knock down gang fortifications. We saw changes to the liquor law, none of which had any measurable or discernible effect on the long-term, deeply seated complex problems about gang membership, gangs in our communities and the criminal offending that's associated with those. Why do we not actually want to address the real underlying problems? And Mr. Farfoy has touched on some of those. Unemployment, social disadvantage, alienation. I think I have made this recommendation in an earlier speech on this bill, but I'd again recommend members of the government parties particularly to get hold of a book called Patched by Jared Gilbert, which presents evidence. It presents a social history of gangs in New Zealand and points out that gangs in some form or another have been around at least since the 1950s. Typically, they were groups of young men, alienated, rebellious. They join a gang, get themselves into mischief and trouble for a few years, and then essentially grow out of it. They'd go and get themselves a job, they'd marry, they'd get a house. The patched gangs that are now the cause or the target of this bill are an unusual phenomenon, and that rather than the members of those gangs join in for a few years and then thinking better of it, discovering there were better ways to spend their lives than bouncing in and out of trouble with the police and jail, was to get on with life in a much more communally acceptable way. The difference is, of course, that the 1980s, the misguided new right policies of the 80s, entrenched unemployment. We are now seeing second and third generation unemployment and second and third generation gang membership. And it is not hard to join the dots, to look at the causal links between those. The attack on the structure and the fabric of New Zealand society as it was prior to the new right so-called revolution of the 90s and carried on into the 2000s. And the fact that we've now got these embedded membership, the multi-generational membership of gangs. And that is a very, very difficult problem to overcome, to address, and we will not do it by little bits of one-off legislation that put some very limited constraints on gang movements, on behaviours, on the members of gangs. I will almost guarantee, I'd be almost willing to wager that there will be legal challenges to this legislation once it's passed. Exactly as we saw in the Whanganui Bill, where members of the Hells Angels deliberately walked around outside the police station, flaunting gang insignia, got themselves arrested, and not only went to court, but actually won the court case, which gave great comfort and added to the mana of gangs rather than diminished it or took away from it. And I think, again, there's a lesson there that hasn't been learned. I will wager that there will be legal challenges to this bill, and probably successful legal challenges based on all sorts of interesting legal propositions that we've yet to see or hear from. So if we were looking for real solutions, and it's unfortunate that I have to say there was the launch this very day at lunchtime just next door in the Grand Hall of the Justice Coalition, which is a cluster of progressive NGOs around the justice sector who have come together with common cause to endeavour to offer good solutions to the problems of crime and offending, imprisonment and all of the other bundle of justice issues, if you like. I must say in passing, the Minister was there, the Minister of Corrections, and announced a very positive policy to have an education strategy for every single inmate in our prisons. And I commend the Minister on that. We will look with interest to ensure that the policy as it is on paper is reinforced with resources and funding to make it succeed. But that's an example of actually a bit of joined-up thinking about criminal offending and prisons and some of the solutions to them, which is a mile away from the sort of nonsense we're seeing in this bill we're debating today. I was interested to see how few National MPs were present at that launch. In fact, other than the Minister, I don't believe I saw one. I did see Labor ministers there, Labor members there rather, Green members present. It's unfortunate that some of the government members supporting this bill were not at that launch, and I commend to them that they have a look and learn a little about the Justice Coalition, who base their operations, among other things, on having a vision about what sort of a New Zealand we want. They have an idea that any legislation or policy should have measurable outcomes, and they suggest that justice legislation, justice policy should be evidence-based. And I'd challenge anybody to put this piece of legislation through that filter. Is it visionary? Will there be measurable outcomes from it? Is it evidence-based? And I would suggest it would fail on all of those measures. It would fail on that filtering, if you like. So tough on crime, soft on crime, let's be smart on crime. Let's look for real solutions we know will work. They're complex, they're multifaceted, they'll require us to spend money differently. We don't have to spend more money on justice, we need to just spend it differently. We need to engage with the communities. Did anybody in the drafting of this bill go out and talk to the gang members about their behaviours and say to them, what would it take for you guys to not behave in these ways? Believe it or not, there are some intelligent thinkers in the gangs. Some of the older gang members have turned the corner. They realise the error of their ways. They have joined things like the White Ribbon and some of the anti-violence and anti-drug movements. There is hope. working collaboratively, engaging with these offenders and former offenders, rather than pretending that these little one-off pieces of legislation will have any positive effect, any positive outcome at all. It will chew up police time. No doubt it will lead to a few arrests. It will lead to legal challenges. Ultimately, it will even lead to enhancing the mana of the gangs, as I've said. It will become a point of pride to have one's gang named in this legislation. So this is a very poor piece of legislation. The Greens will continue to oppose it.
Ian McKelvey.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I don't know what it is about the Greens, Mr Speaker, but every time they speak in this House, it reminds me